All right, hello. Welcome to the third podcast for Paul 200. Our goal for this one is basically to keep us on track with the Aristotle readings. We're going to review and conclude Book 2 of the Politics, which will hopefully set us up for this Thursday's lecture on Books 3 and 4. So let's get started. What's the relationship between the first and second books of Aristotle's Politics? The first book, as we recall, begins with some very big questions and some very big claims. What is the character of political knowledge or expertise? To what extent or in what way is the political community natural? The answers to these questions, as we saw, are ambiguous. Human beings, according to Aristotle, are political animals, but the political community is natural only in the sense that we are compelled towards it. And note as well that the compulsion is not complete. A human being who can live apart from the city may be a beast, but they may also be a god. So human beings require political life, which means that they also require nomos, or law or convention. But our political nature means that we'll dispute over the meaning of the advantages and the disadvantages, the just and the unjust, despite our need for them. We might think that the authority of the city to establish its conception of political justice is grounded in the naturalness of the city itself. But nature does not so much answer the problem of justice as force us to address it. And so you might say that, on the one hand, the first book answers the question about the source of the city's political authority by saying that, the city is rooted in nature, but the problem is that the content of the just and the advantages and the disadvantages that any given city will accept for itself or will try to establish and impose, it's always going to be incomplete, at least in part because nature does not provide these answers for us. And I think this is connected to the question of political expertise. If the standards that we might discern in nature are ambiguous, perhaps the standards, the necessary conditions for applying political expertise are going to be, uncertain. You have to have a certain understanding of the physical world, to apply the skills necessary to be a shoemaker. But perhaps politics doesn't work in quite the same way, precisely because what we need to know from nature is perhaps just radically incomplete. So, the problems of the naturalness of political life and the extent to which reason actually determines political life, it leads Aristotle into Aristotle's analysis of slavery, acquisition, economics, and ultimately the family, the sub-political components of the polis addressed in Book 1, the sub-political components that are ultimately revealed to be political, at least in a sense. Now, we've talked about in lecture about how in the rest of Book 1, Aristotle analyzes the component parts of the Greek city-state in order to consider the ways in which these institutions are in accordance with nature or reason. And they're all found wanting, though in different ways. Nature provides a standard for rule regarding both the family and slavery, though it's one that is simply not respected in practice. Aristotle directs our attention, and the attention of his students, to the injustices of his own slave-owning and patriarchal society as revealed by the standards of what is right by nature. The problem of acquisition or economics, however, illustrates a different problem. The standards of nature are not enough. Human beings must go beyond natural standards of acquisition in order to secure themselves against the indifference of nature. Yet Aristotle warns us that the concern with wealth or acquisition, concern with acquiring the means to fulfill our needs or desires, leads human beings into a never-ending obsession with mere existence or mere life. That is, an obsession with mere means as opposed to the ends or purposes of wealth and acquisition. While nature does not provide us with natural modes of acquisition sufficient to meet our needs, nature does, according to Aristotle, provide us with natural ends or purposes. But what is the purpose of human existence? Not mere life, but the good life, understood as the development of human virtue or human excellence, up to and including the capacity for philosophy. The analysis of the pre-political institutions of the polis bring into question the naturalness of the polis, in that these institutions do not reflect natural standards. Nature dictates a standard of natural slavery. In practice, conventional slavery is rooted not in natural ruling relationships, but instead in war, domination, and ideological mystification. Nature dictates a standard for political rule within the household, a relationship amongst equals. Yet patriarchy is the norm. Nature provides a natural standard that could guide acquisition. Yet in practice, human beings pursue wealth obsessively, or they pursue power or status or security, all of which are in a sense types of acquisitions, right? Human beings turn means into ends and are, in that sense, insane. In Book 1, Aristotle provides his students and the careful reader with enough illumination to see these various limits of the Greek cave, the cave of the polis. So what, if anything, can be done to escape this metaphorical cave or reform it? The implication of Aristotle's analysis of acquisition suggests that the household should and can be oriented towards virtue, a conclusion dealt with in vastly more depth in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Yet, as Aristotle points out at the very end of Book 1, to ask about the kinds of education to virtue within the household, the kinds of education that are possible within the household, forces us to consider the role of the regime. Why is this? Well, even if women, children, and slaves can and should be educated to achieve virtue, there is still some doubt as to whether virtue can or should be defined by the regime. Or rather, the problem is that the regime's definition of virtue is going to, infect any aspect of the political community. In fact, all of Book 1 has alerted the careful reader to the fact that the regime tends to mislead us about the truth about slavery, the importance of acquisition, the legitimacy of patriarchy, and so on. Those are the factors relevant to the Greek polis. So, how much faith should we put in regime-defined virtue? That, I think, is the implicit question that leads into the second book of the Politics. What kind of regime would one pray for? That is the explicit question that begins the second book. Where the first book explored the hypothesis that the institutions of the polis are in some sense natural, this second beginning explores the hypothesis that human social existence is fully political. That is, Aristotle essentially investigates the question of, to what extent can things that appear to be natural, in particular the conventions related to property and the family, to what extent can those things be subjected to political control? To what extent are we free to rearrange these primary social institutions? Aristotle's answer has, I think, three main components. First, regarding the family, and the question of whether political unity can be achieved, or some kind of political good can be achieved by radically reforming the family or even eliminating it, as in the case of the city and speech. The family may be conventional, according to Aristotle, but attempts to eliminate it or even reform it are likely to fail. Even more importantly, such attempts are likely to actually reduce social cohesion. How so? Aristotle argues that the affection formed by the particular bonds of love and affection within the family cannot simply be recreated at the political level. Insofar as we have affection for, say, our neighbors, for our society, that affection is usually rooted in the particular attachments we have in the private sphere. This raises the question of why Socrates proposes the institution, or rather proposes to abolish the family, at least for the guardians, and replace it for something that would actually eliminate affection and thus political unity. Socrates even says that the proposal is impossible. And ultimately, it's shown to not only be impossible, but absurd. So why explore this hypothesis at all? The answer, I think, is that Socrates and Plato are exploring the regime the philosopher would pray for, or perhaps might pray for. The wish to have a regime in which philosophy would be experienced as harmony within the soul. What prevents philosophy from being experienced as harmony within the soul? Love of one's own. The proto-philosopher, who had no attachments based upon love, could emerge from the cave without regret, without fear, or even despair. But such a regime would be impossible, and there's no use praying for it. Philosophy, thus, will always involve a spirited struggle within the self between the love of wisdom and the love of one's own. So, don't pray for the abolition of the family, according to Aristotle. It will not have the effect that you wish. Secondly, the institution of property. Now here, Aristotle points out that the institution of property is far more flexible. And this is a claim which Aristotle supports by references to the various ways in which actual legislators have arranged and redistributed property in the regimes that are familiar to him. In his first discussion of property in the second book, chapter 5, Aristotle, however, emphasizes the problems that accompany any attempt to completely eliminate private property. We might call this simply the problem of communism. The first problem is that you eliminate property and suddenly there's the massive problem of the disconnect between effort and reward vis-a-vis collective property. I emphasized this or illustrated this with the notion of collective grades in a class like Paul 200. If the entire class was simply given the grade, if everyone simply received the average grade, you just imagine the problems that would emerge in terms of figuring out exactly how much work everyone has to perform. This applies in almost any sphere of life. Second problem. Disagreements and conflicts are more likely to arise over shared things as opposed to private things. You cannot solve the problem of property, in other words, or rather the problem of political tensions, simply by eliminating private ownership. Now again, this does not mean that Aristotle necessarily thinks that private property rights are in any sense sacred. I'm not sure if Aristotle thinks much of anything is sacred. He does argue instead that property can in fact be equalized as much as possible. And this is for a simple reason. Yes, attempting to equalize private property will eliminate factional conflict. He also suggests, however, that eliminating property, or even eliminating the sources of factional conflict that come about through unequal property, cannot eliminate the problems of political life completely, because the sources of political disorder are multiple and varied. Political evil arises even in societies in which all or most have access to a moderate amount of property. On the one hand, desires can be unequal. Right? On the second hand, their conflicts can result over questions of honor. And here we can think back to the reference to Homer that is prominent, or at least there in the 5th chapter of Book 2. Another way of thinking about this is that there can be various conflicts over relative status, even if economic needs have been met. Finally, crime occurs, political evil occurs, not merely because of need, because, according to Aristotle, because of enjoyment and the satisfaction of desire. There are, in other words, crimes that have no economic component. You can think of various dimensions of this. It brings to mind, I hope I haven't discussed this example before, I think I probably have, but there was an interesting chapter in the book, I think it was the book Freakonomics, at least they talked about the underlying research. It was talking about the question of why various street-level drug dealers continue to work as drug dealers, even though the job is often dangerous and there's a decent chance you'll end up in jail. They do this despite the fact that they could make more money working at McDonald's. Why pursue a criminal career in that circumstance? There is something here about, there's something, to the notion that this is about, status in the sense of demonstrating your, indifference to the dangers of the profession, right? I guess profession is maybe the wrong word. There's something more, exalted about being a drug dealer, precisely because it has this element of self-conquest, right? In the sense of, the sense of having to conquer your own fear, whether it's fear of violence, fear of consequences. I think some people might say that really the drug dealers are still making a completely economic calculation. It's sort of like the calculation you might make when playing the lottery. That they aren't doing this because they want to, because their spirit is ruling their soul, but rather they're engaged in the kind of economic calculation where they think that, maybe, even though despite all the dangers I might face, maybe I will become, the top man or top woman, I guess. At any rate, what's interesting here as well is the connection that Aristotle makes between criminality and philosophy. Here's what he says at section 1267a5, quote, "For if they, that is, those who commit injustice for enjoyment, have a desire beyond the necessary things, they will commit injustice in order to cure it. And not only for this reason, for they might desire merely the enjoyment that comes with pleasures unaccompanied by pains." I think that here Aristotle wants us to think again of the example of Achilles, quoted just a few lines earlier. Why? Achilles, gives us an example of a strange figure. The individual who has it all, the individual who has achieved the heights in terms of what his own society regards as the authoritative good. He's achieved the heights of the ancient Greek warrior, yet he remains dissatisfied. The greatest warrior, the exemplar of noble virtue, laments the meaninglessness of his virtue given the unavoidable fate of death, a fate shared by the virtuous and the ignoble. So this represents, kind of the existential despair that can be a source of evil, at least in one way. And what Aristotle is suggesting here is that, for those who reach that condition, philosophy is the only cure, right? Philosophy is the pleasure unaccompanied by pain, the desire that stretches beyond the necessary things, that will permit, the only kind of satisfaction that is, that can satisfy those needs. But another way to think of this in terms of the problem of political evil is just to think about it in terms of political ambition. There are those who have a craving for power that goes beyond the necessary things, a craving that can lead to injustice. And of course, history is, filled with these examples, and probably it will continue to be filled with those examples. Now, I'm going to give you a very long quote, not from Aristotle, from something else, in order basically to explicate this notion of political ambition as a source of crime. And the words I'm going to quote are from a political speech by President Abraham Lincoln, sometimes known as the Lyceum speech, though the actual title of the speech is called The Preservation of Our Political Institutions. We don't need to know too much about the context of the speech, but you just need to know, yes, it's about the preservation of our political institutions. The section we're reading, however, deals with the problem or question of political ambition. So, quoting Lincoln now. "But it may be asked, why suppose danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years? And why may we not for 50 times as long? We hope there is no sufficient reason. We hope all dangers may be overcome. But to conclude that no danger may ever arise would itself be extremely dangerous. There are now, and will hereafter be, many causes, dangerous in their tendency, which have not existed heretofore, and which are not too insignificant to merit attention. That our government should have been maintained in its original form from its establishment until now is not much to be wondered at. It had many props to support it through that period, which now are decayed and crumbled away. Through that period, it was felt by all to be an undecided experiment. Now, it is understood to be a successful one. Then, and here, not speaking as Lincoln, he's referring back to the start of the American experiment at the time of the Revolution. Then, all that sought celebrity and fame and distinction expected to find them in the success of that experiment. Their all was staked upon it. Their destiny was inseparably linked with it. Their ambition aspired to display before an admiring world a practical demonstration of the truth of a proposition, which had hitherto been considered, at best, no better than problematical, namely, the capability of a people to govern themselves. If they succeeded, they were to be immortalized. Their names were to be transferred to counties and cities and rivers and mountains, and to be revered and sung and toasted through all time. If they failed, they were to be called knaves and fools, and fanatics for a fleeting hour, then to sink and be forgotten. They succeeded. The experiment is successful, and thousands have won their deathless names in making it so. But the game is caught, and I believe it is true, that with the catching end the pleasures of the chase. This field of glory is harvested, and the crop is already appropriated. But new reapers will arise, and they too will seek a field. It is to deny what the history of the world tells us is true, to suppose that men of ambition and talents will not continue to spring up amongst us. And when they do, they will as naturally seek the gratification of their ruling passion as others have done so before them. The question then, can that gratification be found in supporting and maintaining an edifice that has been erected by others? Most certainly it cannot. Many great and good men sufficiently qualified for any task they should undertake may ever be found, whose ambition would inspire to nothing beyond a seat in Congress, a gubernatorial, or a presidential chair. But such belong not to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. What? Think you these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon? Never. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks regions hitherto unexplored. It sees no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. It denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. It scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. Is it unreasonable then to expect that some man possessed the loftiest genius, coupled with ambition sufficient to push it to the utmost stretch, will at some time spring up among us? And when such a one does, it will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent, to successfully frustrate his designs. Okay, so that gives us one perspective on the problem of political ambition and the way in which political ambition, entirely disconnected from prosaic economic concerns, can be a source of political evil. So what then can be done about these threats to political order? For some, or rather for the many, Aristotle suggests, quote, a minimum of property and work. For others, those who desire honor, moderation is the answer. Now, this is not exactly a well-developed political platform. Aristotle will have much more to say about these solutions to the problems of political disorder. In this chapter, he emphasizes instead the great difficulty of reconciling the desires of the many for equality and the desires of the few for honor and status. As he says, on the very next page, the nature of desire is without limit, and it is with a view to satisfying this that the many live. Achieving a stable balance between those who desire equality and those who desire honor is simply inherently difficult. It's not, if not impossible. You cannot satisfy one group without causing the other to be dissatisfied. But what about the third class of individuals, motivated by desires that go beyond the necessary things and a desire for pleasures unaccompanied by pains? Here is Aristotle's answer. Quote, as for the third, if certain persons should want enjoyment through themselves alone, they should not seek a remedy except in connection with philosophy. For the other measures require human beings. The greatest injustices are committed out of excess, then, not because of the necessary things. No one becomes a tyrant to get in out of the cold. So, while one must address the problems of poverty and inequality, it is not enough to deal with them, as the greatest sources of political disorder lie elsewhere. I want to keep following Aristotle on this tangent just for a little bit and consider what he is saying about the character of philosophy. In a way, Aristotle is suggesting that there is a kind of psychological connection between the tyrant and the philosopher. What is this connection? They both desire independence, though the tyrant seeks independence through power, particularly power over others, you might say power over the world, while the philosopher seeks independence by seeking a happiness that is not dependent upon others. At any rate, Aristotle is fairly quick to point out that the solutions he proposes have limited effectiveness. Economic equality is definitely an advantage, but not a great one. You may give the many work and moderate property, but they will always desire more, for as he said, the nature of their desire is insatiable. The refined and noble may not be satisfied with mere moderation. Perhaps this is why Aristotle suggests that the problem of property involves not only the distribution of property, but the way in which property is used. Aristotle rejects communism, and while he clearly supports some kinds of redistribution of property, he does not think that redistribution solves the political problem. Aristotle instead suggests a political standard for the arrangement of property: private ownership but public use, or perhaps use in common. What this might mean for us today is unclear, but its political significance is very clear. A regime that promoted the public use of private property could help avoid the conflicts caused by differences in property ownership. It could cement interpersonal trust and cooperation, allow individuals to exercise the virtues of magnanimity and liberality, virtues involving the use, not the acquisition of things. Here is one way to think about this vision of property relations. Aristotle thinks that private property can and should be used for political or public purposes, while still remaining private. And in this way, the love of one's own can be extended into the public sphere, thereby actually enhancing the experience within a political community. Or that's the intention, at any rate. The examples that Aristotle gives of the public use of private property, of Spartans sharing dogs, slaves, horses, and so on, it might make us think that the private ownership common use standards may simply not be applicable to our own times. Given his later criticisms of the Spartan regime in Book 2, this should remind us of the fact that a society might very well regulate property and property relations in a good way, yet still be defective for other reasons. We have to ask ourselves whether we still agree that it is, quotes, the task peculiar to the legislator to make citizens who will be willing to use their property in common. Our own political options seem to boil down to two alternatives. There are those who want private property to remain private as much as possible, and there are those who wish to take from the rich and give to the poor, or rather, take from the rich and give to the upper middle class members of public sector unions. Now, Aristotle's notion of private property combined with common use is one way in which his critique of certain political prayers slowly starts to reveal his own vision of what is possible in political life. In other words, Aristotle slowly starts to reveal in the second book what he regards as worthy of prayer, politically speaking. In order to understand how Aristotle is evaluating the various actual regimes he addresses at the end of Book 2, it is helpful to consider Aristotle's discussion at the very beginning of Book 4 of the various perspectives that you can take as a political theorist when evaluating political communities. Aristotle compares the political theorist to what we today would call a personal trainer in order to illuminate differing modes of theorizing. Okay, so we'll go through this comparison between the physical trainer and the political theorist. On the one hand, you can think of 4 different approaches that a physical trainer might take for training. On the one hand, the physical trainer can ask the general question, what is advantageous for what sort of body? In other words, what is advantageous for the particular situation of a given person, given their age, given their general health, their interests, so on and so forth. And the analog at the level of political theory is the question of what regime is fitting for what particular cities. And you can call this applied political theorizing, right? Taking a very concrete city and thinking, well, what is necessary what is necessary or even possible within this particular condition. Second type of physical training, what kind of training is best for the very best body? So let's say that you're training LeBron James, and so you have to consider, what is necessary, what would be fitting or best for the individual who has the best, natural endowment. And the analog at the level of political theory is theorizing about the very best regime, which you might also call ideal theorizing. What would be the best political community, without having to take into account the very specific types of political situations that any given regime is going to face. Third category, what is best for most bodies, right? This might be how a physical trainer would, try to advance their business on the internet, giving advice about what is typically going to be the best way to exercise or the best nutritional program to follow or so on. There's an analog at the level of political theory. A regime, and when you ask about the regime that is most fitting for all cities or for most cities, that is what usually in most situations can a given regime aim at. And we might call this generic theorizing, thinking about what is almost always a legitimate political possibility. The final category, Aristotle describes it in this way. What is best, and here he's actually still talking about physical training. What is best for those unconcerned with the disposition or knowledge associated with competition? Now, what is he talking about here? I think that it's actually helpful. It's actually easier to understand the political analog before we talk about the analog, the comparison in terms of physical training. Aristotle says that some type of theorizing will theorize about regimes based upon their own presuppositions. And this is what we might call conditional theorizing. And Aristotle will actually demonstrate much of this in the course of the Politics. What does it mean to theorize based on a presupposition? It's basically to say, okay, given what this society already believes, given its own conception of the authoritative good, how do its own practices, say, relate to or support its presupposition? So, you also can think of it in terms of, say, contemporary political theory, where much of it is essentially democratic theory, thinking about what is necessary and good for democratic societies, as opposed to asking more fundamental questions about, how good is democracy? What might be the analog at the level of physical training? There's an author whose name I can't recall, who explained it this way. She basically said that, you can think of this in terms of someone who wants to lose a whole bunch of weight in a very short period of time because they want to look good on the beach in the summer, or they have an important social event, and this isn't really healthy, and it's not really necessary, but nevertheless the physical trainer will know what to suggest in those circumstances. That's what Aristotle will compare with offering advice to a tyrant. Right? Okay, so applied theorizing about what is best in a particular situation for a particular regime. Ideal theorizing, the best regime, theorizing about what is just the ultimate or best society. Generic theorizing, the regime that's fitting for most cities. And conditional theorizing, or theorizing based upon a presupposition. Okay, so Aristotle begins to apply some of these modes of theorizing when discussing Plato's laws. And not having read Plato's laws, we're not going to spend much time reviewing it, but we should note several dimensions to Aristotle's analysis. First, in his discussion of the laws, Aristotle raises the question or problem of foreign policy. And you can see this at section 1265a20. And here he makes the reasonable suggestion that regimes must be concerned not only with the arrangements that affect their own citizens, but also with their relationships with other regimes. This issue will return as it raises the question of whether concerns with the problems of power, the preeminent concern of international affairs, whether those concerns should trump concerns with domestic arrangements or domestic policy. Now, we should also note Aristotle's description of the regime of the laws at 1265b25. Quote, "The organization of the regime as a whole is intended to be neither democracy nor oligarchy, but the one midway between them, which is called polity." Now, if he institutes this as being the most attainable of all regimes for cities, he has perhaps argued rightly. But if as being the best after the first sort of regime, not so, for one might well praise that of the Spartans more, or some other that is more aristocratic. So here we see Aristotle distinguishing between what I've called generic theorizing, theorizing which aims at what is possible for most regimes, and ideal theorizing, theorizing which aims at what is best simply. Generic theory leads us to expect that, for most regimes, a balance between the competing principles of oligarchy and democracy will be possible. Such a regime, described here as a polity, will later be described as the good or non-perverted form of democracy. But what about the best regime simply? Here Aristotle is somewhat ambiguous. He appears to state that ideal theorizing supports some kind of aristocracy, or, as in the case of Sparta, at least a regime that mixes together a broader range of principles. His criticisms of the Spartan regime in Book 2, however, suggest that this actually existing alternative to polity is radically deficient. As we will see, the role of the best regime and ideal theorizing are both ambiguous in Aristotle's thought. On an abstract level, he seems fairly clear on what the ideal regime would be, an aristocracy based upon virtue. Yet, his extended discussion of the best regime in Book 7 will reveal many ambiguities. At the very least, the suggestion raised in Book 2, Chapter 6, that Sparta is the best regime, is not sustained. The regime held by many Greeks to be the best in practice is, from Aristotle's perspective, very far from ideal. So here we've come to one of the central mysteries or problems of the politics. What is the relationship between the concept of polity, a regime that attempts in some ways to combine the principles of oligarchy and democracy, and the best regime? Let's turn to Aristotle's analysis and the final 3 books of Book 2 of the regimes that are held to be best in practice. First question, why does Aristotle focus on these particular regimes, particularly Sparta and Crete? Sparta was in general regarded as the best or most admirable of the Greek regimes by the Greeks themselves. Many Athenian oligarchs would have agreed that this was the best regime. And Crete was regarded as a kind of model of the Spartan regime. So this helps to explain why Aristotle chooses these particular cities for analysis. In criticizing the cave of Greek civilization, he chooses to focus on its highest exemplars, or at least its most admired exemplars. Interestingly, Plato's Laws features a discussion between an Athenian stranger, a Cretan, and a Spartan. The latter two are considering plans to establish a colony, and they ask the stranger for advice. The actual advice in the Laws ends up turning into a kind of criticism of Spartan and Cretan practices. That is, it is a critique of the ideals of Greek civilization. A second question that you might have thinking about these final books, or at least it's one that occurs to me, is that there's a relative silence regarding the role of religion in these regimes. There's no mention or any direct criticism of the common belief that the founders of Crete and Sparta were inspired by the gods. So Aristotle's relative silence on the role of religion in politics is rather deafening, at least in comparison with Plato. We might say that Aristotle wishes to remove religion from the political sphere. At least he doesn't seem to want to highlight its role. Perhaps you could say the same thing about Plato's Socrates in some ways, at least insofar as if you think way back to the theology presented in Book 2 of the Republic, even though the gods play a kind of political role, you might say almost a moral role for Socrates, they are withdrawn somewhat from any direct connection to the particular political institutions of the city. Anyway, leaving that aside for now. What are the consequences of the Spartan institutions analyzed by Aristotle? Now we come right away to a puzzle, and the puzzle is that in the entire section, Aristotle claims to be examining the regimes in light of their own presuppositions and in light of the best regime. But at this point, he hasn't really articulated what the best regime is. That will come at the end of the book, and even then it will be somewhat ambiguous. The answer appears to be, or the resolution to the puzzle seems to be, that for Aristotle, we have to ascend to what is best through a consideration of what is familiar. Along the way, Aristotle will provide indications of what political regimes can, in fact, aim for. We've already seen one dimension of this in his introduction of the concept of polity in the discussion of Plato's laws. In Aristotle's discussion of Sparta, he seems to introduce another standard for evaluating any regime, the standard of leisure. Any good regime must provide leisure from the necessary things. A finely governed regime must achieve this, though this might not be the only standard. Yet this raises all kinds of questions. Do we judge regimes only by the existence of leisure, or by how that leisure is used? Aristotle is not saying we, should judge regimes based upon whether, the average middle-class person can afford to take a winter holiday to Cuba or whatever. A further problem here, what can be allowed in pursuit of genuine freedom or leisure? For instance, how does this goal of leisure, this goal of transcending necessity, relate to equality and justice? The problematic relationship between leisure and justice might explain why Aristotle is relatively indirect in his criticism of slavery in general. But in regards to Spartan slavery, however, Aristotle is directly critical. Why is this? Well, in light of the standard of the best regime, a regime that aims to create freedom from necessity, the Spartan institution of slavery actually fails to achieve its purpose. In order to maintain their caste system, the Spartans have to spend all of their time and energy keeping the Helots down. There are various historical stories about what was necessary for the Spartans to do this. There are some stories about how, as part of their training, Spartan teenagers would essentially, at various points in time, hunt down and kill Helots. And there were various public festivals that were basically enacted to demonstrate the superiority of the Spartan citizens to the subject classes that they held as slaves, to humiliate them, essentially. Now, like a lot of historical questions, there are some disagreements here, and some would say that, the practices of the Spartans were perhaps not as bad as that of other regimes, at least insofar as the Helots seem to have had something like a separate existence, and they were not simply treated as chattel, as property. They were not traded around to different cities, for instance, and therefore they seem to be a little bit more like Russian serfs, as opposed to the kinds of slavery that existed in other Greek city-states, where you move your slaves around wherever you want them. You just treat them as movable property. They have no place, right? So there's some disagreement there. Still, the Helots had their homes. They even had families. They weren't necessarily treated as property the way slaves were in other city-states. But every now and then, the Spartans would just come and kill you for sort of these ceremonial, sacrificial purposes. At any rate, note that Aristotle has brought together two different criticisms of slavery in the Politics. Criticism of slavery in light of natural justice, and criticism of slavery in light of natural ends. Though we might note that the latter criticism is surely situational. The main problem with the Spartan system of slavery is that the entire society has to be oriented around preserving it. In light of what is best, this is not desirable. It doesn't produce the desired effect. It doesn't produce freedom to necessity. It subordinates the Spartans to necessity. In light of the presuppositions of the Spartan regime, however, that is, the presupposition that power is the most important factor in political life, slavery is in fact very useful for them. The constant war against the Helot class allows the Spartan warriors to be essentially in a constant state of battle readiness. You might also add that the ceremonial humiliation of the Helot class reinforces the esprit de corps of the Spartan citizen warriors as well. Now, Aristotle notes that the educational system of the city, particularly in relation to women, is incorrect, both regarding the intention of the regime, that is the presupposition or hypothesis of the regime, and in light of what is best. This implies that the institution of slavery as practiced in Sparta is in accordance with the particular aims of that regime. As I said, maintaining slavery does not help Spartans achieve what is best, but it does help Sparta maintain what they consider to be authoritative military preparedness and power. Now, in what ways is the educational system defective? The Spartan regime simply does not take women into account. The regime aims at military prowess. It's a timocracy, a warlike or honor-loving regime, but it leaves women entirely within the private realm, outside the scope of public education. And here Aristotle says this is at odds not only with the presuppositions of the regime, but with what is best. The private orientation of the wives in Sparta is at odds with the public orientation of the regime itself, the regime devoted to war. And this introduces an unavoidable element of corruption. Aristotle emphasizes the role that bribery plays in Spartan political institutions, basically suggesting, and this is Aristotle suggesting this, that within the private sphere, essentially he's saying that the Spartan wives are encouraging a kind of selfishness and a focus on the private sphere that is at odds with the public teaching, the public education of the regime. And as a consequence, the Spartan husbands, when they're placed within positions of power, have a tendency to try to use their power not for simply the public good, but at self-aggrandizement. So there's this real tension between the Spartan regime, between sort of the private motivations and the public education, which of course is teaching everybody to be, standing in the phalanx and being a brave warrior for Sparta. Now, would it make sense? Would it be good for the Spartans to extend the educational system to women? Does Aristotle imply that it would not necessarily be desirable, given that the presuppositions of the regime itself are erroneous? The regime aims at military virtue, which is part of virtue, but it's only a means, not an end. The Spartans aim for domination, but they do not know how to be at leisure. And this might, in a lot of ways, be the most severe criticism that Aristotle could make of any regime. You don't know what to do once you have been freed from necessity. And yet, Aristotle does seem to suggest that the Spartan polis would be stronger and better if its regime took into account the education of women. There's no point creating a city of public-spirited male warriors if the women of the city suffer from oligarchy of the soul. But here's the question. In what sense, in general, is it good to extend the educational principles of a regime to everyone in a regime if the principles of the regime are seriously defective? You might think that this question of how to best educate women in an ancient warrior republic is not really a question of much practical consequence today. Yet, while the particulars of the issue have changed, the form of the problem has not. That is, the problem is, in what ways is it good to be educated in the virtues of a defective regime? How beneficial is it to gain access to the education provided by the regimes of North America, Europe, by any advanced industrial country, that is, with our peculiar mixture of oligarchic and democratic elements? And here we have to understand, of course, that education refers not only to, what we would call formal education, but education in the principles of the regime, education in the conventions, the nomos, that guide our conception of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and so on. Now, we can consider this in light of the transformation that the feminist movement has had upon the world of work and the family. And please note here that, in what I'm about to say, I'm not criticizing the theory of feminism. Let me discuss, this issue in relation to the relatively popular show, or I don't know, I guess it's popular, I'm not even sure, a show I watch occasionally, Mad Men. Now, the relative popularity of this show, illustrates that the issues that emerged along with feminism in the 50s and 60s, or that version of feminism in the 1950s and 60s and later, that those issues have not, they haven't been fully resolved, right? These issues haven't become irrelevant. Even though in some ways the main message of the show's writers is that, formerly all the world was mad. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it, Mad Men essentially traces the transformation of work and family life over the course of the 1960s, at least work and family life for a very small subset of people. Madison Avenue executives, advertising executives, madmen, and their wives and families. The advantages and disadvantages of the old regime, the pre-feminist world, are embodied by the character Don Draper, an advertising executive of exceptional abilities and exceptionally low morals. He's a serial philanderer, and this is presented as more or less the norm for early 1960s Madison Avenue executives. Now, the personal descent of Don Draper over the course of the show is paralleled by the professional rise of Peggy Olson and Joan Harris, two former secretaries in the firm. What's it called? Cooper Price or Price Cooper? I always forget. Anyway, these are two former secretaries who, in advancing their careers, show themselves to be the equal to Don, both in terms of genius, though of course we're talking about advertising here, but at any rate, they're just as good as Don, particularly Peggy, and they actually outdo him in terms of competence, leadership, and so forth. The ascent of Peggy and Joan is anything but painless, but they achieve mastery, or at least success, within a formerly male-dominated world. While the public world is transformed by women, the private world of the family in this show is transformed by infidelity and divorce, and the latter development is presented more or less as a consequence of untamed hetero-male sexuality. So, gaining access to the public world, or the value of gaining access to the public world, whether you're talking about Sparta or talking about Mad Men, depends upon the character of the regime itself. The madness of the madmen in the show is exhibited, I think, in their utter devotion to their profession. A profession of advertising that is truly nothing but shadows on the wall of the cave. Not that there's anything wrong with that, not that I'm discouraging you from, pursuing a career in advertising, but yet, access, what is the ultimate value of access to this particular world? At the very least, we would have to say the value of liberation from the private realm would depend upon, the value of accessing the oligarchic public world, where success is measured in terms of wealth and kind of petty office rivalries, the kind of power you can achieve within an advertising firm. Better than confinement to the private realm, surely, but nevertheless not an unallied good. Mad Men, the show, does not idealize the private realm, but I think more than any other contemporary narrative, at least ones on television, it raises questions about the madness of the semi-public, semi-private realm we know of as the workplace. We might have to ask, to what extent does our own oligarchy, that is, a society is oligarchic insofar as it's devoted to, wealth and the workplace as the primary, ways in which you exhibit virtue, does our oligarchy become better or more complete by the complete extension of oligarchic standards? Would Aristotle look, if we sat Aristotle down and had him, watch that first season of Mad Men, would he suggest that, what this shows is that the principal defect of North American regimes is that they have not extended the principles of oligarchy into the corner of every soul of every man, woman, and child in the entire nation? You don't have to be a critic of feminism to see that many of the practical goals of feminism, again, not primarily as a theory, I don't think, because I think feminist theorists are very much attentive to these problems, but more in terms of the actual political practice of feminism, at least amongst the educated, amongst upper middle class or upper aspirants to the upper middle class. Many of the practical goals of that form of feminism depend upon the presupposition that the authoritative goods of our own technological oligarchy are self-evidently desirable. So, in regards to Sparta, Aristotle's critique of the exclusion of the Spartan women from the regime is much less significant than his critique of the regime itself. The Spartans love only a part of virtue, the warlike virtue that is useful for domination. To quote Aristotle, "Yet, while they, the Spartans, preserved themselves as long as they were at war, they came to ruin when they were ruling an empire, through not knowing how to be at leisure, and because there is no training among them that has more authority than war." A regime, and perhaps a soul, should be judged not by how it deals with the necessary things, whether you're talking about war or advertising. The real question is how you live once the necessary things have been accounted for. All right, so I'm surely missing many things of great importance, but I'm going to proceed now from Aristotle's discussion of Sparta in chapter 9 to his discussion of Carthage in, I believe, chapter 11. We're just skipping over Crete. Nothing to say right now about Crete. If you have questions about Crete, come talk to me during office hours. All right, so let's turn to Carthage. In his discussion of Carthage, Aristotle will again address two concepts that are absolutely crucial to his political science: the concept of polity and the concept of a mixed regime. How are these things related? And of course, the question of the best regime will also be there as well in the background. Let's go over again the notion of polity. The basic notion of a polity is that it is a regime governed by the people, at least in some sense, the many, the hoi polloi, in the interest of all or the common good. In Book 3, Aristotle will contrast polity with democracy, and the democracy in that context is presented as a kind of deviant regime, the rule of the people in the interest of the people. And there's an implied comparison between that kind of tyranny, or that kind of democracy, and tyranny. The concept of a mixed regime is connected to, but still distinct from, the concept of polity. The basic idea of the mixed regime is as follows. So, given that there are differing claims to rule, to exercise power, and given that these differing claims to rule all share in part of the truth, is it possible to mix these differing claims together? You can say, is it possible to mix together democracy and oligarchy? Is it possible even to include Spartan presuppositions about the priority of military affairs, and so on? So, to what extent does this Carthaginian regime embody either the principles of polity or the mixed regime? Aristotle states some general principles that he applies here. He asks, when looking at the Carthaginian regime, do the people acquiesce in this regime? Is there much factional conflict worth mentioning? Has there ever been a tyrant? Now, it's curious to note that he does not adopt the standard of leisure here, as he did in the case of the Spartans, at least not exactly, at least not as far as I can see. The political standards he addresses in this chapter don't seem to be those standards rooted in the best possible regime. Rather, he seems to be evaluating Carthage, in some ways, on the basis of what is most possible, at least at first. The Carthaginians do fairly well according to the three standards that Aristotle introduces at first. Of course, for the modern social scientists, the standards raise all kinds of empirical questions. What exactly does it mean to acquiesce in a regime? Is the absence of outright revolt the same as support for the regime, and so on. The bigger question is whether Carthage, or any kind of regime, should be evaluated according to more exacting standards. Carthage represents a mixed regime insofar as it attempts to combine rule of the people, rule on the basis of wealth, and rule on the basis of virtue. We need not concern ourselves here with the specific institutional details, except to observe that the Carthaginian regime combines a kind of direct democracy. The people have the authority to rule on various proposals. But this is combined with a senate and a monarchy whose membership is based upon selection from a small range of noble families. The problem with the regime, according to Aristotle, is that it leans too far in the direction of oligarchy. And this is interesting. He says it leans too far in the direction of oligarchy due to the opinion of the many and the opinion of the few that political power should be based not only on merit but on wealth as well. This is on the grounds that wealth is necessary for the leisure required for political life. Aristotle criticizes this particular mixture of oligarchic and aristocratic principles, arguing that the best arrangement would make it possible for the best or most virtuous to be at leisure. So you can see how Aristotle starts in this chapter by evaluating Carthage, from a relatively low standard. Have there been a lot of tyrants? That's not a huge hurdle to overcome. But as he moves through the chapter, he starts raising this question of, what I call ideal theorizing. How do the Carthaginian arrangements look from the perspective of what would be best? So even worse for the Carthaginians, the fact it was even worse than the fact that they placed too much value or honor in wealth. Even worse is the fact that they actually allow some of their highest offices to be put up for sale. Again, on the grounds that those who are able and willing to pay for an official position will be most capable of exercising power. Now, we should note here that Aristotle does not deny the oligarchic principle entirely. He suggests that a certain amount of property is necessary for exercising political power, and it's a perspective that many of us would still regard as somewhat relevant. We would hesitate to elect a person to office if, say, despite having a university education, they had lived all their lives, their adult lives, in their parents' basement playing video games. Such a person could be smart, such a person could be intelligent, such a person might be a potential philosopher, but it would be legitimate to wonder whether they possess sufficient political virtue, that is, to be elected to high office. Now, what's also interesting here is that Aristotle suggests that it's the laws or political institutions themselves which shape the attitudes of the citizens. Direct quote, "For this law, the law about purchasing offices, makes wealth something more honored than virtue, and the city as a whole greedy. For whatever the authoritative element conceives to be honorable will necessarily be followed by the other citizens." End quote. That's a pretty strong assertion. The institutions that determine political power determine what is held in honor, and that in turn determines the way of life of the whole regime. Now, in considering this claim, our first instinct might be to say that it just doesn't apply to our own political order. We do not think that the political order or the arrangement of offices determines what we view as honorable or desirable. We are much more likely to think that the arrow of causality runs in the opposite direction. That is, we tend to think that the political is determined by the social or the economic, at least in the final analysis. We don't think that the political necessarily determines the social or the economic. True, we might think of political partisanship as expressions of different conceptions of the good life. A vote for the Tories in Canada as opposed to a vote for the NDP or the Green Party implies a different assessment of what is necessary for the good life, at least to some degree, as well as different estimations of the meaning of justice and so on. I don't know what voting liberal means. Now we should note here that Aristotle would not necessarily regard representative democracy as equivalent to democracy per se. Now this is somewhat strange, this is something strange to think about. Our regime utterly rejects, or seems to reject, the claim that there are principles of rule that exist independently of popular will. Yet we also, for the most part, strictly limit the scope of public participation. We'll have to return to the question of whether or in what way modern parliamentary democracies, ultimately rooted in the sovereignty of the people, relate to the kinds of institutions discussed by Aristotle, institutions which balance conflicting claims to rule in a much more open manner. Okay, back to Carthage. We're probably sympathetic to Aristotle's criticisms of the oligarchic tendencies of Carthage. We are perhaps less sympathetic to the claim that immediately follows his criticisms of the oligarchic tendencies of the regime. He follows that with claiming that those capable of ruling best should rule. In other words, he evaluates it in light of aristocracy. It's almost as if he's following the principles of the Republic. This is confirmed in the following paragraph, where Aristotle suggests that the ability of Carthaginians to hold multiple offices is in error, as, quote, one task is best accomplished by one person, end quote, thereby alluding to the Socratic standard of government on the basis of expertise. Yet the solution to this problem, the solution that Aristotle proposes here, is not Socratic. Or at least, not directly Socratic. It's certainly not the recommendation based on the Guardians or the City speech. Quoting Aristotle here, except where the city is small, it is more political to have more persons share in offices, and also more popular. This is clear in military and maritime matters, for in both cases, ruling and being ruled extends through practically everything. So here Aristotle suggests that the offices should be spread as far as possible, almost in the manner of a military organization. What's happening here? Aristotle, in order to correct the oligarchic defects of the Carthaginian regime, suggests a kind of democratic corrective. The institutions of Carthage attempt to integrate wealth and virtue to some extent, but they pay insufficient attention to democratic principles. To counterbalance the oligarchic deviations of this regime, Aristotle suggests a model of political power that would allow power to be shared while still remaining hierarchical in some sense. But what exactly is he talking about here? What would it mean to organize political offices or political power as if it were a military organization? Aristotle does not fully explain this. Well, we can think of it this way. On the one hand, military organizations tend to be meritocratic, at least in times of war, or we would say particularly in times of war. So Aristotle is suggesting a model of political power which is open to all regardless of wealth or family background. You don't have to have a famous mother or a famous father to succeed in the military. More important is the claim that even if it's organized in a hierarchical manner, the military would allow power to be exercised at varying levels. In other words, generals set the overall strategy, yet the individual units must have a considerable degree of freedom in order to respond to conditions on the ground. How could that be used as a model in politics? We should note that Aristotle's suggestion that politics could be arranged like an army in no way implies that this in no way implies that militaristic aims should dominate the society. We should also note that in trying to explain how ruling and being ruled could extend through practically everything, Aristotle refers not only to military matters but maritime matters. I hope you won't mind if I engage in a bit of interpretive fancy here. This reference to maritime matters in a political context can't help but bring to mind the notion of the ship of state from Book 6 of Plato's Republic. There, the image was meant to suggest that the philosopher or astronomer possesses a kind of knowledge that would justify them ruling as monarchs. Aristotle does not really repudiate that position exactly, but he suggests instead that while there might be forms of knowledge that are politically relevant, forms of knowledge that are only held by a few, there may also be forms of political knowledge that can be widely shared and should be widely distributed. So, however unusual this might be, and however elitist Aristotle might be in suggesting that there are those who possess rare forms of political virtue or rare forms of political knowledge, it is interesting that Aristotle thinks that incorporating democracy into a regime requires the people, the poor, to actually exercise power, as opposed to modern democratic politics, where the poor are simply there to be represented by well-meaning lawyers. So, what are we to think about the issues that Aristotle introduces here at the end of Book 2, or at the end of this chapter? Aristotle has introduced us, or is starting to introduce us, to his science of regimes, a science which aims to articulate the partial truths involved in different claims to exercises of political power, and he attempts to think of ways to incorporate or mix these partial truths into various political orders, so as to reflect the overall truth about politics as a whole. The Carthaginian regime, leaning towards oligarchy, needs to be corrected through mechanisms that are both democratic and aristocratic. One question raised in the final chapter of Book 2 is whether Athens was able to achieve this in any way. The argument of this final book is as follows. Aristotle does not claim to be the first that oligarchic regimes, or even regimes that lean in an oligarchic direction, need to be corrected by incorporating democracy, the power or strength of the people. Others have tried this as well. In the case of Athens, however, the problem is that in expanding the power of the people, Solon seemed to send Athens on a completely democratic trajectory, one that ultimately had disastrous consequences for the city. And this raises the question of whether a regime that attempts to mix or combine distinct principles, the regime that Aristotle calls polity, can in fact be stabilized. Or once you try to mix these separate principles, isn't it unavoidable that one principle wins out? This is the question that in various ways will concern him, at various points throughout the rest of the politics. Let's review some of the main elements of Book 2. The central question or purpose of the book was to examine opinions about the best regime, or the regime that one would pray for. Aristotle examines theories of what would be best, as well as actual examples of regimes that are held to be best. In criticizing the theoretical visions of the best regime, Aristotle emphasizes the limits of reason or rationality in political life. For instance, in Aristotle's critique of the city and speech, he suggests that the way in which the city aims at unity, the way in which the city and speech aims at unity, will fail to achieve the unity which cities are actually capable of. The family is not simply natural, but it's not entirely conventional. Most importantly, according to Aristotle, the strength of attachments found within the family, the strength of attachments based upon direct personal ties, cannot be transferred to the political level. Removing personal ties, particularly though not only the ties between parents and children, will not create a society with stronger attachments. Rather, the opposite. What then is the point of the thought experiment? At least in regards to the question of the family, Socrates has experimented with the idea of what it would mean for a society to be structured so as to promote philosophy. The rather frightening point is that love of one's own is an obstacle to philosophy. In my own lectures, I emphasize the ways in which the city and speech, by aiming at complete political unity, actually makes philosophy impossible. But we should note that that criticism applies mostly to the city constructed by the end of Book 4. Aristotle's criticisms aim at the beautiful city. He rejects that model, implicitly rejecting the notion that societies can or should be arranged so as to eliminate the tension between the pursuit of wisdom and love of one's own, the unavoidable tension between philosophy and politics. Next issue, the problem of property. Here, Aristotle admits that the apparently pre-political institution of property is in fact subject to law and can in fact be subjected to a variety of conventions. The institution of property is more subject to social construction than the institution of the family. Aristotle admits that property can and should be arranged so as to limit factional conflict, even though he also stresses the fact that eliminating private property would fail to eliminate political evil. At the same time, you'll not only fail to eliminate political evil by eliminating property, you'll create some easily anticipated adverse consequences. He suggests the task of the legislator is to find a way to transcend the limits of radical communism and possessive individualism by making it so citizens are able and willing to use private property in common. Hippodamus and the problem of convention. This is something I discussed in lecture. I didn't talk about it in this review podcast, and I'll say more about it in the next lecture. But the crucial point to note here is that the problem of reforming political communities in light of any kind of political theory is radically different from that of pursuing progress in other arts. This is not merely because some institutions are necessary even though they haven't been rationally designed. It is because convention itself is necessary in the sense of unreflective belief or faith in certain practices. Thinking now about his discussion of actual historical regimes, the most important thing to see here is that Aristotle is introducing and evaluating these regimes in light of the concepts of the best regime and polity. The great unanswered question of this section. Should regimes be judged according to their ability to achieve or foster what is highest or best, that is the standard of aristocracy, what appears to be the standard of the best regime? Or should regimes be judged by their ability to reconcile differing, conflicting, but partially correct political claims? What should guide the political theorist? The best regime or polity? We'll return to some of these questions next week.